It's been a couple of weeks since Final Fantasy XVI launched, and my predictions have proven 100% true. The game undersold compared to Final Fantasy 15. It sold like 3 million units at launch, or shipped 3 million units at launch. Its sales have dropped like 90% over the next couple of weeks. It's looking like a real disaster at Square Enix, and I don't see a lot of people talking about what this means. I don't see a lot of people addressing it. Like, there are a handful of like Twitter users like finally addressing what was obvious to me like a couple of weeks ago, that Final Fantasy 16 was going to bomb. So let's talk about like the long-term consequences of this. Like, what is going to happen? 100% Square Enix is done. Like, this is it for them. This is it. It's over. Like, done and dusted. This is the end result of them like constantly worshiping PlayStation, constantly trying to recreate the success of Final Fantasy VII, and like constantly undermining their talent, constantly like downplaying the success of Nintendo RPGs, like constantly trying to move away from like their classic turn-based like RPG style and focus of like chasing westernized trends. This is a direct result of their actions. They are in a position where there is no righting this ship, right? This has been in the works for 20 years since the release of before the release of Final Fantasy X-2, right? This has been an issue since Final Fantasy VIII, in which, a game that like Sakaguchi didn't directly work on all that much, that came out with like new talent and was just a complete disaster with, like a focus on like a story that didn't make any sense and characters, but people loved it because, it's Final Fantasy on PlayStation. Let's downplay all these weird problems with the junction system and the plot that doesn't make any sense and like just the mediocre gameplay. Let's just hype this up as the next big thing. This was what considered one of the best RPGs ever made for a long time, purely because of the Final Fantasy branding. And then, of course, Final Fantasy X had problems. X-2 was a complete disaster. People don't even talk about X-2. 11 was a disaster. 12, 13, 13.2, 13.3, 14. Like, who do you know who even talks about the original release of 14? 15 and now 16. Like, Final Fantasy has been bad now longer than it ever was good, right? Final Fantasy 6 came out in like what, 1994, right? So like they had like 6 great games, right? 7 was okay. 8 was a disaster. It's been like a downward spiral ever since, and like it's extended to a lot of other aspects of their business. It's expanded to like their other IPs, their other franchises. It's become a complete train wreck, and nobody has wanted to admit it for the longest time, to the point where Final Fantasy 16 is a straight up failure. And not only are people not wanting to admit it, they're trying to like downplay the reasons why it happened. They are trying to ignore that Square Enix, one of the major pillars of PlayStation exclusives in the 90s, the developers behind like the lauded Final Fantasy VII, right? One of the most overhyped games ever made, are in the process of going bankrupt. They are in the process of losing their branding. They have lost everything that made Final Fantasy special, and nobody wants to admit it. Nobody wants to admit that this series is a shell of its former self and is in no way capable of like competing with its contemporaries in any way, shape, or form. It is hilarious to me how Zelda has managed to eclipse Final Fantasy in spite of Final Fantasy like traditionally being quite a bit more popular than it, especially in like the 90s. Final Fantasy had like, a much bigger following for a long time because of like, being a story-driven franchise and, writing off like the anime hype of the 90s and just being like, a PlayStation exclusive, like one of the most overhyped PlayStation franchises ever, right? Final Fantasy, the legendary Final Fantasy VII. It was so bad that like, Final Fantasy VII R got re-released, and a lot of people who haven't played an RPG since 7, got back into it and tried saying it was the best RPG I've ever played, in spite of, never playing any other RPGs. It's for a long time, like Final Fantasy was coasting off in nostalgia, that worship of the brand. Like the series can't do anything wrong. It has the best stories, the best graphics, the best music, the best turn-based gameplay. Like, it's the best there is at what it does. And over the past 20 years, it's becoming increasingly obvious that that isn't the case. Dragon Quest does what Final Fantasy does better. Fire Emblem, has its audience. You have like Shin Megami Tensei, you have Persona, you have like these other subsidiary franchises. You have like all these smaller JRPGs that are just building more and more of an audience because Final Fantasy, which used to be the premier JRPG franchise worldwide, has been like slowly losing its audience, for due to all the bad decisions they've made. And it's not just a result of Final Fantasy 16, right? Like a lot of people are making this mistake that like Final Fantasy 16 looked bad or it looked underwhelming or people weren't into it. No, if anything, I saw the trailer and was kind of intrigued by it. I thought that like maybe I might check it out on PC, but like no, I'm not buying a PlayStation 5 for it. I'm not buying it right when it comes out. But like I thought like I could see myself, yeah, maybe I'll try it out like at some point in the future. But I still don't own Final Fantasy 15. I've still never played 14. I've never played 13. And when you've gone this long without playing like a new mainline Final Fantasy game, like it's really difficult to get back into it. Like the people who are buying this stuff religiously have like gotten to the point now where they've broken the habit of buying every new Final Fantasy game, hoping it's going to be good out of like respect and love for the iconic originals, right? They bought all these sequels, all of these games because of the branding, because of the legacy, because of the IP. And they've reached the point now where nobody really cares anymore, where a mainline Final Fantasy game can come out and just get stomped into the dirt by the Nintendo Switch, by what Nintendo is doing, right? Like it's not even like competitive anymore, right? Back in the day, they used to like, even when like the sales were going down with 13, like they at least were able to be major releases, but 16, I don't think it's going to be that. Like I think this is like a massive disaster, and I don't think there's any correcting this. I don't think there's anything Square Enix could possibly do, right? They can't go back to Nintendo. Nintendo already has their own RPG franchises that are better than modern Final Fantasy, right? They can't keep relying on Sony money because they're leaving the industry. Like it's legit possible that like with PlayStation going downhill the way it is, like Square Enix might be in an extremely compromising position where the company that has propped them up since the 90s is suddenly going to stop producing consoles, and suddenly the audience that worship Final Fantasy as like one of their pillars it's going to be homeless. Like, Xbox doesn't care about Final Fantasy. Like Nintendo, loves Final Fantasy, but, we have alternatives. We have several other JRPG franchises that have actually had relevant high quality releases in the past 20 years. Who exactly would get excited over like, oh, the 13 trilogy is coming to Switch? Like that's not a thing that's going to happen ever, right? It's embarrassing how bad these things have gotten. Like I remember asking for like a release of Final Fantasy 15 on Switch, and I never asked for a release of Final Fantasy 16, right? Like I know it can be released. I know there's nothing stopping them from doing it. I know it could easily run on the Switch. Like I know that, right? But like I don't want the game. Like I don't need it. I don't care about it at all. I have so many other games I need to play. I'm just not all that interested in playing yet another mediocre Final Fantasy game. And I think the vast majority of the audience feels the exact same way as I do. Like the days of Final Fantasy being one of the biggest brands in gaming are long over.